Hello, I am Nomiki Konst, and welcome to the Nomiki Show. If you are new to this channel, please, if you have a chance, click the subscribe button on YouTube. And of course, we are so grateful if you can if you like our channel, become a member on Patreon at patreon.com/the Nomiki Show. We are a new show. We're less than a month old, and we are, trying to build our subscribers so that we can produce more content, have a well-paid team, and go out there and deliver the types of stories that are not being featured in the mainstream media, and uncovering what's happening in the establishment world. Why is it that they keep using these tactics over and over again against the movement, and what can you do to fight back? Today we have a really great guest. His name is Rob Howse. Rob Howse, I've known him for about a year or so, a little bit over a year now, and he has become one of my go-to favorites when it comes to understanding the theories behind where we are in this movement, and how what we're seeing looking forward. Rob is an international law professor at NYU, and he wrote a great piece on populism today, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So Rob, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure, Nomiki.
And I have to say, you're in Jamaica right now. What a trooper! Taking a vacation and still finding time to talk about the great issues of today. So we appreciate that.
No problem.
So let's just get right to it. You wrote this piece on populism. It's very timely, and it's extremely apropos of what we're facing. You wrote it a few months ago, and I went back and reread it, and I'm thinking, oh my God, he has like a crystal ball. What is it about populism today that is different than, say, the populism of Truman era?
Well, one difference, which is kind of obvious, is digital information technology, which allows for a kind of populism that is much more grassroots, that isn't simply dependent on a top-down structure where a leader uses media, propaganda to create followers behind an ideology. But rather, now the people are not just the objects of populism, but could actively participate in ways they couldn't really in the past, apart from being called out to mass rallies and demonstrations. So although that's often pointed to as still the face of populism, a lot of what's going on in social media and alternative media represents a grassroots version that wasn't really possible 60 or 70 years ago.
In the last 40 years, you've seen Democrats, and it's now sort of in the mainstream, people are aware of it, but people like Thomas Frank have written about the rise of the Democratic Leadership Council, the New Democrats, this version of the Democrats that emerged in the late 70s when Carter was president, and it was essentially the corporatizing of the Democratic Party as unions were under attack. And we've talked a lot about this in the past, that sort of simultaneous, you had like the Koch brothers just infuse cash into Republican state legislatures, as even, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, as the demographics have shifted more to the left. So do you think that the Democratic, the Democratic status quo, the establishment, whoever had the controlling forces back under Carter even, anticipated the rise of populism, and that's why they decided to take on unions and bring in the lobbyists? What was sort of their mindset back then?
Well, I think part of the mindset was that they were on the run or on the defensive from the new right. Neoconservatism, free market, neoliberal ideology was becoming very prominent, in the universities and in think tanks, and was obviously fueled by the interests of big money. And so calling yourself even a liberal became something of an anathema. And so liberalism was afraid to speak its name. and that gave birth, I think, to a form of politics in the Democratic Party that was always reacting to in the defensive against the GOP and the right. And that kind of defensiveness is a disaster if you really want to achieve anything.
My question, I always wondered why they didn't just pivot on some issues that protected working people, because they still need their base, but we're more socially conservative. Of course, the Democrats were socially conservative too. They were fiscally conservative and socially conservative. But they would say, because they needed this coalition, of a diverse coalition, and of women in particular, they were, even though their policies were straight up racist and anti-feminist, anti-woman, they were able to kind of pull this veil over the party, as if they were more moral than the Republicans during the era of the Christian right, infusing cash into the Republican Party and trickle down economics. So, I mean, let's just go back 30 years or 35 years to the 80s, right? What actually was the difference? Because it's almost hard to see now. What actually was the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans during that time?
Well, there were some Democrats who thought they could take the Republican attack on "quote unquote" big government and respond to it through different kinds of policies that were less directly redistributive, making the market and incentives work to achieve social objectives. And so, there was the attitude, well, we basically have to make these concessions to the attack on, the welfare state, the attack on the big redistributive state that the right and the Republicans have made. But, having made those concessions, we're going to try and find some other means of, achieving, objectives of social justice that avoids the supposed pitfalls of past progressive policies and programs. And of course, what they ended up with was very little, because once you're in the world of incentives, you're playing by a different game, and you basically, what you're doing is you're trying to bribe or buy business to act in a way that supports your social goals. So basically, this was the strategy. And if you even look at the 2016 Hillary Clinton platform, where there are all these proposals on social issues, industrial policy, and so forth, all of them are really dependent, instead of the state being activist, on bribing or incentivizing the private sector to achieve those goals. And so this is very convenient, because what it means is that you achieve, or at least try to achieve, social objectives at the same time as you're putting money in the pockets of your big donors. So this whole attitude of incentivizing, quote unquote, the private sector to achieve social goals is quite consistent with a political system where big money controls most legislators and politicians generally.
It's interesting too, because I guess time does reveal so much, but you think of the Democrats were able to hold the House for decades, and it wasn't until this neoliberal mindset, this ideology took over the Democratic Party. Now, yes, of course, Bill Clinton won the election in '92, but he also, we also lost the House for with exception to a couple of moments where Republicans were polling so low that we won back the House briefly. I mean, right now we have the House because of Republicans polling so low, but it's kind of it's so interesting how this mythology of this being the way, this mindset, well, what other way would we have? Well, the way that the Democrats have always been leaning left populist, until you decided that you wanted to infuse the lobbyist cash in, and we got Dukakis and lost. And then we lost the House after we had it for 30 years. And I mean, it's just kind of, mind-blowing that you have people like James Carville out there, claiming that Michael Bennett, of all people,
Yeah.
is the path to victory. Of course, Michael Bennett is not in the race anymore as if he was before. But you have these icons, right, from the era of the Clintonian era, that all, including Joe Biden, who came up with this ideology and repeat it over and over and over on CNN, and in mainstream media and in the New York Times editorial pages. But it doesn't seem to really be working. Like they're struggling to keep it together, controlling every way that they can, even if it means spreading smears about Bernie so he goes down 1% before the Nevada caucus. But I mean, moving forward, it just seems undeniable that we're going into an era of the populist left, a reversal, that society seems to fix, at least in democracies, to fix itself. But then on the alternative side, we have Bloomberg. So what do you see moving forward for both scenarios? If we do elect a Bloomberg, or if we do get Bernie Sanders, if he squeaks through, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I mean, the election of Bloomberg would be something even newer in the politics of the Democratic Party, because it would be the election of somebody who is an independent slash Republican as a Democrat, and that would really be a break, even with the more recent traditions, where the corporatist Democrats still came out of and believed, or said they believed, they came out of the progressive FDR tradition. It's just that they had the challenge of adapting it to the quote unquote realities of globalization and so on, and what we've learned about what government can do well and what government can't do well and so on. But they still came out of that tradition. I mean, Bloomberg comes out of a different tradition, which what might be called moderate, Republican. In other words, a Republican who, does not buy the full extremist, sexist, racist messages. Sort of more like Romney or perhaps the elder Bush, that may be just as tough in many ways on economic policy, but is not a fanatic anti-liberal on social questions. Mm-hmm. But this would be a tremendous change, that he comes in from the outside, basically, and becomes the leader of the party, and basically uses it for a kind of Republican light agenda.
Although he's also revealed that he's not great on social issues either. He doesn't respect women. His policies are blatantly racist through his own words. It just hasn't been exposed through this lens, at least on a national scale, with a on a national stage as well. Okay, so if he wins,
right? They
yeah. No, go ahead.
But I don't. But they're not they're not coming from the same place. They're coming from kind of old boy chauvinism and billionaire arrogance, rather than a kind of counter ideology of white supremacism and men taking back the control. So it comes from a different place, and somehow that makes some quote unquote liberals more prepared to excuse it or look the other way.
As long as they're making money off of it.
Exactly. As long as they're raking in the Bloomberg cash. Exactly.
So if you have this situation where populism is having a moment again, right? Not even a moment. It's really always there. There's an undercurrent of populism because we're not a country made up of wealthy people. We have income inequality that's stark. We have workers' rights and being completely wrecked at this point, and Wall Street's doing better than ever. So let's, there's something there that needs to be explained, and of course, Bernie Sanders is a great vehicle for that. But knowing history and what you've written about in terms of populism and global populism specifically right now, um, is this different? Is this worse than after 1929? I mean, are we seeing a more concentrated rebellion, a more of populism? Is there more here?
Well, let's talk about the difference, for example, between Bernie Sanders and Trump. And as you know, there are some pundits in the mainstream media who like to create a kind of equivalence between the two of them, in the sense that both seem to be able to inspire some sort of very loyal following and to bring a certain kind of passion and passionate discourse into political life.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the huge differences that it seems to me distinguishes the Sanders form of populism from most of the others that are out there that are often associated with nativism, racism, and so on, is that Sanders populism is really bottom up, and you see that because he inspires so many other people to become leaders.
Mm-hmm.
His populism doesn't stop with followership and
Right.
wearing Bernie Sanders merchandise. It results in has resulted in already thousands of people, very diverse people, thinking for the first time in their life, I ought to run for office and I ought to turn my beliefs into the exercise of political power. And so that's a different form of populism. It isn't about worshiping the leader, which is what the establishment says is the common ground between Trump and Sanders. And if you look at Trump, he's not inspired new generations of Trumpists. Thank God for that. I mean, it's just all about him, right? And followers are just that. They're followers. They're people to scream and yell at rallies, not people to go out and organize in union halls or run for DA on a progressive platform or run for Congress as a democratic socialist in Mississippi, as one of my former students is now doing. And I think that's a
Great.
huge difference. Yeah.
No, it is. I mean, I think that when we look at Trump and his quote unquote populism, as the mainstream media likes to describe it, of course he himself is a I wouldn't say an oligarch, maybe he thinks he's an oligarch, but he is of the wealthy class. He comes from this. We're from New York. We know exactly what Trump is, just as we know who Bloomberg is, and he was able to sort of weaponize his New Yorker spirit into becoming this character of populism, which couldn't be further from the truth. And it was, I think, it was a Steve Bannon creation, Steve Bannon and Roger Stone. But it was also aspirational. And then it was people who wanted to be wealthy and thought this is a business guy who knows how to solve problems for the regular people. It's kind of, in a weird way, a trickle down economics mindset. But then on the other hand, you but he has a movement. I mean, we have to say, like, this is somebody who has been able to consolidate the Republican Party, which has real infrastructure in every state in America, except, maybe with exception to New York State. And then alternatively, we have Bernie Sanders, who is just the opposite. Even though the movement has won over many seats in the Democratic Party, he's built an independent movement, like an organizational movement, grassroots movement, whether organized by his people or just separately. And that, I think, is why he is such a strong force of nature against Trump versus pretty much every other candidate. He comes there with this organization that can defeat another organization. But let's take it globally, because I think there are trends here, and you you obviously travel the world and work on this on a daily basis. But let's see, like Corbyn populism versus Boris Johnson populism. Let's look at Italy and Greece. I mean, very different countries, and Spain, of course, has had a real rise in the left populism. What's happening in Europe? Let's just stick to Europe, and South America is a whole other story.
Right. Well, we start with Greece, with which you're also very, very familiar.
Thanks
We
to
had
you.
the phenomenon well, also thanks to your own connections there, pacification, which was the notion that the traditional social democratic parties were no longer responding to the needs of working people. And that was for a number of reasons. One was they increasingly became the parties of technocratic elites, and another reason was they were victims of their own success. The social welfare state, the social contract, made enormous numbers of people better off. It gave them a minimum amount of human security, but the flip side of that was corruption, and they kind of believed that they were doing the right thing, and so they didn't worry so much about an internal culture that was increasingly becoming nepotistic and corrupt. And one of the features of populism that I think is often neglected and is really, really important is that populism views politics not just about results. It views politics as also about the means that you use, and it's important, therefore, that political parties not be corrupt. It's important that they be genuinely inclusive, and that offices be open to people with ability and different perspectives. And until the economic crises that sort of spanned the late 70s, through the last decade, the old style social democrats, or liberals, as we might call them in the U.S., could say to themselves, "Okay, we're a bit corrupt. So we don't operate as an ideal democracy or give new people the opportunity and diverse voices the opportunity to be part of the power of our movement. But we've been making most ordinary people, working people, better off, giving their children even more hope for the future. But when the economic crises kind of accumulate, and that's no longer the case, then the one thing that excuses their corruption and inbred elitism, which is producing results that are generally speaking good for working people, that starts to collapse. And then what the right realizes is that in the presence of that situation, even though the right doesn't have much of an economic alternative, and that's why it does have identity politics, and they start playing identity politics as a way of winning over working class people who would have in the past voted for the left on economic issues, and also winning over people who care primarily about the fact that mainstream liberal / social democratic politics has become corrupt. They're tired of corruption. They're tired of the scandals, and they're tired of leaders who are constantly being arrested for bribery.
Right.
And so that's another dimension of populism, that it isn't all about ideology, left versus right. It's also about the demand for a cleaner politics. And Tunisia is an interesting example, where a moderate conservative Muslim, a law professor who nobody heard of, all of a sudden won the election. And why? Because he appeared to be honest and free of corruption and not connected to any of those old entrenched corrupt elites. And to my mind, this is also the advantage that Bernie Sanders has, that he can appeal across the political spectrum to people who are just fed up with corrupt machine politics, whether it's the corrupt, disruptive politics of Trump or the corrupt establishment politics in the Democratic Party. And so it's not just about socialism versus moderates. It's also about the fact that a significant percentage of people are just fed up with that style of politics that just normalizes dishonesty, corruption, and the disproportionate influence of immense wealth on politicians.
It actually, without going down this rabbit hole, but it reminds me a lot of the history of Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall being in many ways notorious for corruption, but it also was there to represent immigrants and get jobs for people who weren't getting jobs, and find representation for Italians and Jews and Greeks, people who were not being reflected in the very like old school white establishment, the old white families of New York. Looking at Greece with Syriza, or of course the Labour Party with Corbyn, the centrists will say, "Oh, we can't go with the extreme left because look what they're going to lose. Look at Corbyn. Look at Syriza. Look what's happening. In Italy, for instance, the left can't win in Italy. It's just far right." Is that accurate? I mean, maybe we should look at Corbyn specifically because there's a lot of theories about Brexit, but he also inherited a party that was not pro-Corbyn. And I think that is more, if there's anything to be learned out of that story, I actually think that's something that Bernie Sanders might happen to him, is he's going to inherit a Democratic Party that's not all in for him. But how much of that,
Right.
is similar?
I was saying to a friend the other day that it's really Tony Blair who's responsible for Brexit, because Tony Blair destroyed the old Labour Party, and so working people who were the losers or didn't benefit from from neoliberalism had no place to go anymore. No progressive place to go, and so they were easily capable of being, at least some of them, mobilized. Their resentments, their fears, their sense of being left behind, then was capable of being mobilized by certain forces on the right, and which emerged as in significant measure the Brexit movement. But in destroying the one party that had the ability to represent and speak for those people, I mean, Blair really prepared the ground for the current situation in Britain. And so, I'm hesitant to be critical of Corbyn, but in a way, both his immense appeal and his problem was the idea of going back to old Labor, to the roots of old Labor, the policies of old Labor. And I think he was not entirely persuasive, to a lot of people that could really be done in the same way, given all the changes in the world, globalization, digital economy, and so on. And I think this is not, I mean, the Sanders movement is different. And that's, one of the great things is enlisting and inspiring new leaders, people in their 20s like AOC and so on. And so they're not talking about, going back to progressive industrial workers socialism. We can't go back to that, if only because of climate change, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
so while Corbyn was, I think, much loved and admired as representing what was admirable in old Labor that Blair had destroyed with disastrous consequences, I don't think he was seen, as tomorrow's leader, in the sense that many of the, his catchwords and even ideas like reversing privatizations and so on seem like turning back the clock rather than moving forward to something like a Green New Deal, for example.
Yeah, I mean that's very sharp. we also have a different country. We're a much more diverse country. I mean, there is diversity, absolutely. There are immigrants in the UK, but it's more homogenous as a party. I mean, the workforce is different. The trade issues were different. I was really fascinated going there and covering the labor conference 2 years ago, and just keeping in touch with all the Momentum people. But there was and also just in general, the election span. It's a tighter election. They threw in a ton of money right at the end to smear him, and they've been doing that against Bernie for a while. Whether it works or doesn't, it's probably just going to come down to, if it does work, a couple of percentages of points, because he's been able to weather the storm over the last 5-6 years of smears. So
I think also Bernie is much more, and this goes back to the point of inspiring not just followers but leaders, much more prepared
right,
to share the stage with much younger people, with
right.
new leaders like Ilhan Omar and so on. Corbyn wasn't really prepared to do that. Partly it's not his fault. I mean, the dynamics within the Labour Party in many
That's
ways
right.
were so poisonous that he had to run a tight ship.
That's right.
So, there's some very promising, younger people. Maybe you ran into some of them, like Danny Lammy, when you were covering the Labor conference, who really came to national prominence, opposing Brexit much more forcefully and unambiguously than did Corbyn and the circle around him. But it was impossible for Corbyn kind of to share the stage with those people. That was a problem for
Mm-hmm.
him because it threatened, the unification of the party around his message and his group. And so I have much more hope for Bernie than for Corbyn. I didn't think Corbyn was going to win, and those are some of the reasons why it's so important. I mean, the symbolism when Bernie campaigns with AOC is
Yeah.
very important. There may be I mean, Bernie Sanders may be the founder of the movement out of Occupy and other sources, democratic socialism and so on, but he's not the only leader. The leadership is shared, and that's so important because there are many people who wouldn't identify with Corbyn's, sort of older, nostalgic, working class labor style, but with another, leader, maybe somebody from a minority community, half
Mm-hmm.
his age, standing beside him, that would have been a much more powerful message.
Yeah. It's fascinating because we complain about our electoral cycle and being so long, but we pace things out, and we bring communities out for touching on you go to one state that it looks like one community, and then another that's Iowa's white but has immigrants. You go to a state like New Hampshire, it's very so as a result, you have to, in the US, in a presidential campaign, build these coalitions, especially if you're on the populist left, in a way that Jeremy Corbyn, even if he wanted to, the time range of the election cycle is so short. It really worked to his detriment. So I hope that they can continue to build this movement. I think that's sort of the lesson that I've learned from you, really, is that because of electoral politics in other modern democracies, they're having more difficulty building the movement that we have been able to build in the United States, a sustainable movement. So hoping that Bernie Sanders wins, and it creates a wave, a long lasting wave across the world. Rob, final thoughts. I'm gonna attach your article in the links on Patreon and on YouTube. But any other thoughts about moving forward?
I'm hopeful that the Trump-style populism will have a limited shelf life, and I think that's really has to do with this fact that there are only followers and no new leaders. As you say, Trump has really managed to take control of the GOP, and once he's gone, there's going to be really nothing left, except a kind of cauldron of resentments and regrets. So that if I think we can look forward to a new era of progressive leadership in American politics, provided that we can beat the last stand of the oligarchy, which may be in the form of Bloomberg.
Yeah, and Trump. Gosh, if Bernie defeats both of them, wow,
Yeah.
it's gonna be great. Rob Howse, always a pleasure. Hope you can come on again. Come into
I'd
studio
love
when you're back in New York.
Thanks very much.
Of course.
And thanks for your tolerance of the less than ideal conditions here for recording.
You're doing. Hey, you're on vacation. I'm just grateful that you're on.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rob. If you're not already subscribing, please click the subscribe button on YouTube on The Nomiki Show. And of course, become a member on Patreon at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. One final plug, forgot to do it at the top. We have a live show in Los Angeles on Super Tuesday where we're doing coverage of Super Tuesday at this amazing space in front of a live audience with extraordinary guests. There's some that are still a secret, but we have our own Michael Brooks, who's going to be on stage with us, coming in from New York. Alona Minkowski, always also coming in from New York. Francesca Fiorentini, LA Charger, Justin Jackson, Nando Villa, and David Dian's going to be delivering some data as the night goes on. It's really going to be an awesome show. And, obviously we want you to buy tickets, but I just like hanging out with all my friends. So hope you can join. The tickets are also in the link below at bit.ly/LA Super Tues, capital S, capital T. Thanks, everyone.